Hartwig Nade, born 1894, a forwarding agent and Nazi Party member since 1937, commander of 2nd Company. Paul Brand, born 1902. Heinz Buchmann, born 1904, owner of a family lumber business, party member since 1937. Oscar Peters, born 1905. Walter Hopner, born 1908, tea importer, party member briefly in 1930, rejoined in the spring of 1933. Hans Scheer, born 1908 and a party member since May 1933. Kurt Drucker, born 1909, a salesman and party member since 1939. Thus, their ages range from 33 to 48. 5 were party members, but none belonged to the SS. Of the 32 non-commissioned officers on whom we have information, 22 were party members and 7 were in the SS. They ranged in age from 27 to 40 years old. Their average age was 33 and a half. They were not reservists, but rather pre-war recruits to the police. Of the rank and file, the vast majority were from Hamburg area. About 63% were of working class background, but few were skilled laborers. The majority of them held typical Hamburg working class jobs. Dock workers and truck drivers were most numerous, but there were also many warehouse and construction workers, machine operators, seamen, and waiters. About 35% were lower middle class, virtually all of them white-collar workers. 3/4 were in sales of some sort, and the other 1/4 performed various office jobs in both the government and private sector. The number of independent artisans and small businessmen was very small. Only a handful, about 2%, were middle-class professionals, and very modest ones at that, such as druggists and teachers. The average age of the men was 39. Over half were between 37 and 42, a group considered too old for the army but most heavily conscripted for reserve police duty after September 1939. Among the rank-and-file policemen, about 25%, were party members in 1942. 6 were Altkampfer, who had joined the party before Hitler came to power. Another 6 joined in 1933. Despite the domestic ban on new party members from 1933 to 1937, another 6 men who worked aboard ships were admitted by the party section for members living overseas. 16 joined in 1937, when the ban on new membership was lifted. The remaining 9 joined in 1939 or later. The men of the lower middle class background held party membership in an only slightly higher proportion, 30%, than those from the working class, 25%. The men of the Reserve Police Battalion 101 were from the lower orders of German society. They had experienced neither social nor geographic mobility. Very few were economically independent. Except for apprenticeship or vocational training, virtually none had any education after leaving terminal secondary school at age 14 or 15. By 1942, a surprisingly high percentage had become party members. However, because the interrogating officials did not record such information, we do not know how many had been communist, socialist, and/or labor union members before 1933. Presumably, a not insignificant number must have been, given their social origins. By virtue of their age, of course, all went through their formative period in the pre-Nazi era. These were men who had known political standards and moral norms other than those of the Nazis. Most came from Hamburg, by reputation one of the least Nazified cities in Germany, and the majority came from a social class that had been anti-Nazi in its political culture. These men would not seem to have been a very promising group from which to recruit mass murderers on behalf of the Nazi vision of a racial utopia free of Jews. Starting on chapter 7 now, page 55, where that first 2 is. It was probably on July 11th that Globnisik or someone on his staff contacted Major Trapp and informed him that Reserve Battalion 101 had the task of rounding up the 1,800 Jews in Josephau, a village about 30 kilometers slightly south and east of Bilgoraj. This time, however, most of the Jews were not to be relocated. Only the male Jews of working age were to be sent to one of the Globnisik camps in Lublin. The women, children, and elderly were simply to be shot on the spot. Buchmann, when 38 years old, was the head of a family lumber business in Hamburg. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1937, drafted in the police order in 1939, and had served as a driver in Poland. In the summer of 1940 he applied for a discharge. Instead, he went to officer training and commissioned a reserve lieutenant in 1941. He was given command of the 1st Platoon of 1st Company in 1942. Upon learning of the imminent massacre, Bookman made clear to Hagen that as Hamburg businessman and reserve lieutenant, he would in no case participate in such an action in which defenseless women and children are shot. He asked for another assignment. Hagen arranged for Bookman to be in charge of the escort of the male work Jews who were to be selected out and taken to Lublin. His company captain, Wuhlhoff, was informed of Bookman's assignment, but not the reason for it. The men were not officially informed other than they would be awakened early in the morning for a major action involving the entire battalion. But some had at least a hint of what was to come. Captain Wuhlhoff told a group of his men that an extremely interesting task awaited them the next day. Another man who complained that he was being left behind to guard the barracks was told by his company adjutant to be happy that you don't have to come. You'll see what happens. Sergeant Heinrich Steinmetz warned his men of the 3rd Platoon, 2nd Company, that he didn't want to see any cowards. Additional ammunition was given out. One policeman reported that his unit was given whips, which led to rumors of a Judenation. No one else, however, remembered whips. Departing from Bilgoraj around 2 a.m., the truck convoy arrived in Josephow just as the sky was beginning to lighten. Trapp assembled the men in a half circle and addressed them. After explaining the battalion's murderous assignment, he made his extraordinary offer. Any of the older men who did not feel up to the task that lay before them could step out. Trapp paused, and after some moments one man from 3rd Company, Otto Julius Schimke, stepped forward. Captain Hoffman, who arrived in Josephow directly from Zachrozow from the 3rd Platoon of 3rd Company, had not been part of the officers' meetings in Bilgoraj the day before, was furious that one of his men had been the first to break ranks. Hoffman began to berate Schimke, but Trapp cut him off. After he had taken Schimke under his protection, some 10 or 12 other men stepped forward as well. They turned in their rifles and were told to await a further assignment from the major. Trapp then summoned the company commanders and gave them their respective assignments. The orders were relayed by the 1st Sergeant Kammer to 1st Company and by Nade and Hoffman to 2nd and 3rd Companies. 2 platoons of 3rd Company were to surround the village. The men were explicitly ordered to shoot anyone trying to escape. The remaining men were to round up the Jews and take them to the marketplace. Those too sick or frail to walk to the marketplace, as well as infants and anyone offering resistance or attempting to hide, were to be shot on the spot. Thereafter, a few men of 1st Company were to escort the work Jews who had been selected at the marketplace, while the rest of 1st Company was to proceed to the forest to form the firing squads. The Jews were to be loaded onto the battalion trucks by 2nd Company, and 3rd Platoon of 3rd Company had shuttled from the marketplace to the forest. While Trapp complained of his orders and wept, his men proceeded to carry out the battalion's task. The non-commissioned officers divided some of their men into search teams of 2, 3, or 4 and sent them into the Jewish section of Josephow. Other men were assigned as guards along the streets leading to the marketplace or at the marketplace itself. As the Jews were driven out of their houses and the immobile were shot, the air was filled with screams and gunfire. As one policeman noted, it was a small town and they could hear everything. Many police admitted seeing the corpses of those who had been shot during the search, but only 2 admitted having shot. Again, several policemen admitted having heard that all the patients in the Jewish hospital or old people's home had been shot on the spot, though no one admitted having actually seen the shooting or taken part. The witnesses were at least agreed on the question of how the men initially reacted to the problem of shooting infants. Some claimed that along with the elderly and sick, infants were among those shot and left lying in the houses, doorways, and streets of the town. Others, however, stressed quite specifically that in this initial action the men were still shied from shooting infants during the search and clearing operation. One policeman was emphatic that among the Jews shot in our section of town there were no infants or small children. I would like to say that almost tactically everyone refrained from shooting infants and small children. In Josephau, as later he observed, even in the face of death, the Jewish mothers did not separate from their children. Thus we tolerated the mothers taking their small children to the marketplace in Josephau. Another policeman likewise noted that tactfully the shooting of infants and small children was avoided by almost all the men involved. During the entire morning I was able to observe that men being taken away from many women carried infants in their arms and led small children by the hand. According to both witnesses, none of the officers intervened when infants were brought to the marketplace. Another policeman, however, recalled that after clearing operation, his unit, 3rd Platoon, 3rd Company, was reproached by Captain Hoffman. We had not proceeded energetically enough. As the roundup neared completion, the men of 1st Company were withdrawn from the search and given a quick lesson in the gruesome task that awaited them. They were instructed by the battalion doctor and the company's first sergeant, one musically inclined policeman who frequently played the violin on social evenings along with the doctor, who played a wonderful accordion, recalled, I believe that at this point all officers of the battalion were present, especially our battalion physician, Dr. Schoenfelder. He now had to explain to us precisely how we had to shoot in order to induce the immediate death of the victims. I remember exactly that for this demonstration he drew or outlined the contour of a human body, at least from the shoulders upward, and then indicated precisely the point on which the fixed bayonet was to be placed as an aiming guide. When the first truckload of 35 or 40 Jews arrived, an equal number of policemen came forward and face to face were paired off with their victims. Led by Kammer, the policemen and Jews marched down the forest path. They turned off into the woods at a point indicated by Captain Woolhoff, who busied himself throughout the day selecting the execution sites. Kammer then ordered the Jews to lie down in a row. The policemen stepped up behind them, placed their bayonets on the backbone above the shoulder blades as early instructed, and on Kammer's orders fired in unison. But when the men of 1st Company were summoned to the marketplace, instructed in giving a neck shot and sent to the woods to kill Jews, some of them tried to make up for the opportunity they had missed earlier. One policeman approached 1st Sergeant Kammer, who he knew well. He confessed that the task was repugnant to him and asked for a different assignment. Kammer obliged, assigning him to guard duty on the edge of the forest, where he remained throughout the day. Several other policemen who knew Kammer well were given guard duty along the truck route. After shooting for some time, another group of policemen approached Kammer and said they could not continue. He released them from the firing squad and reassigned them to accompany the trucks. 2 policemen made the mistake of approaching Captain Woolhoff instead of Kammer. They pleaded that they too were fathers with children and could not continue. Woolhoff curtly refused them, indicating that they could lie down alongside the victims. At the midday pause, however, Kammer relieved not only these 2 men, but a number of other older men as well. They were sent back to the marketplace accompanied by a non-commissioned officer who reported a Trapp. Trapp dismissed them from further duty and permitted them to return early to the barracks in Bilgoraj. Some policemen who did not request to be released from the firing squad sought other ways to evade. Non-commissioned officers armed with submachine guns had to be assigned to give so-called mercy shots, because both from excitement as well as intentionally individual policemen shot past their victims. Others had taken evasive action earlier. During the clearing operation, some men of 1st Company hid in the Catholic priest's garden until they grew afraid that their absence would be noticed. Returning to the marketplace, they jumped aboard a truck that was going to pick up Jews from a nearby village in order to have an excuse for their absence. Others hung around the marketplace because they did not want to round up Jews during the search. Still others spent as much time as possible searching the houses so as not to be present at the marketplace, or they feared being assigned to a firing squad. A driver assigned to take Jews to the forest made only one trip before he asked to be relieved. Presumably his nerves were not strong enough to drive more Jews to the shooting site, commented the man who took over his truck and his duties of chauffeuring Jews to their death. After the men of 1st Company departed for the woods, 2nd Company was left to complete the roundup and load Jews onto the truck. When the first salvo was heard from the woods, a terrible cry swept the marketplace as the collected Jews realized their fate. Thereafter, however, a quiet composure, indeed, in the words of German witnesses, an unbelievable and astonishing composure, settled over the Jews. In contrast to First Company, the men of Second Company received no instruction on how to carry out the shooting. Initially, bayonets were not fixed as an aiming guide, and as Hergert noted, there was a considerable number of missed shots that led to unnecessary wounding of the victims. One of the policemen in Herger's unit likewise noted the difficulty the men had in aiming properly. At first we shot freehand, then one aimed too high, the entire skull exploded. As a consequence, brains and bones flew everywhere. Thus we were instructed to place the bayonet point on the neck. According to Hergert, however, using fixed bayonets as an aiming guide was no solution. Through the point-blank shot that was thus required, the bullet struck the head of the victim at such a trajectory that often the entire skull, or at least the entire rear skull cap, was torn off, and the blood, bone splinters, and brains sprayed everywhere and besmirched the shooters. Hergert was emphatic that no one in First Platoon was given the option of withdrawing beforehand, but once the executions began and men approached either him or Scheer, because they could not shoot women and children, they were given other duties. This was confirmed by one of his men. During the execution, word spread that anyone who could not take it any longer could report. He went on to note, I myself took part in some 10 shootings in which I had to shoot men and women. I simply could not shoot at people anymore, which became apparent to my sergeant, Hergert, because at the end I repeatedly shot past. For this reason he relieved me. Other comrades were also relieved sooner or later because they simply could no longer continue. Lieutenant Jucker's 2nd Platoon and the bulk of Sergeant Steinmetz's 3rd Platoon were assigned to yet another part of the forest. Like Scheer's men, they were divided into small groups of 5 to 8 each rather than large groups of 35 to 40 as in Woolhoff's First Company. The men were told to place the end of their carbines on the cervical vertebrae at the base of the neck, but here too the shooting was done initially without fixed bayonets as a guide. The results were horrifying. The shooters were gruesomely besmirched with blood, brains, and bone splinters. It hung to their clothing. George Kegler, a 37-year-old tailor, made it through the first round before encountering difficulty. After I'd carried out the first shooting at the unloading point, was allotted a mother with a daughter as victims for the next shooting. I began a conversation with them and learned that they were Germans from Kassel, and I took the decision not to participate further in the executions. The entire business was now so repugnant to me that I returned to my platoon leader and told him that I was still sick and asked for my release. Kegler was sent to guard the marketplace. Neither his pre-execution conversation with his victim nor his discovery that there were German Jews in Josephau was unique. Schimke, the man who had first stepped out, encountered a Jew from Hamburg in the marketplace, as did a second policeman. Yet another policeman remembered that the first Jew he shot was a decorated World War I veteran from Bremen who begged in vain for mercy. Franz Kostenbaum, who during his official interrogation had denied remembering anything about the killing of Jews in Poland, suddenly appeared uninvited at the office of the Hamburg State Prosecutor investigating Reserve Police Battalion 101. He told how he had been a member of a firing squad of 7 or 8 men that had taken its victims into the woods and shot them in the neck at point-blank range. This procedure had been repeated until the 4th victim. The shooting of the men was so repugnant to me that I missed the 4th man. It's simply no longer possible for me to aim accurately. I suddenly felt nauseous and ran away from the shooting site. I have expressed myself incorrectly just now. It was not that I could no longer aim accurately, rather than the 4th time I intentionally missed. I then ran into the woods, vomited, and sat down against a tree. To make sure that no one was nearby, I called loudly into the woods because I wanted to be alone. Today I can say that my nerves were totally finished. I think I remained alone in the woods for some 2 to 3 hours. Kastenbaum then returned to the edge of the woods and rode an empty truck back to the marketplace. He suffered no consequences. His absence had gone unnoticed because the firing squads had been all mixed up and randomly assigned. He had come to make this statement, he explained to the investigating attorney, because he had no peace since attempting to conceal the shooting action. Most of those who found the shooting impossible to bear quit very early, but not always. The men in one squad had already shot 10 to 20 Jews each when they finally asked to be relieved. As one of them explained, I especially asked to be relieved because the man next to me shot so impossibly. Apparently, he always aimed his gun too high, producing terrible wounds in his victims. In many cases, the entire backs of victims' heads were torn off so that the brains sprayed all over. I simply couldn't watch it any longer. At the unloading point, Sergeant Bentheim watched men emerge from the woods covered with blood and brains, morale shaken and nerves finished. Those who asked to be relieved he advised to slink away to the marketplace. As a result, the number of policemen gathered on the marketplace grew constantly. As with First Company, alcohol was made available to the policemen under Drucker and Steinmetz, who stayed in the forest and continued shooting. As darkness approached at the end of a long summer day and their murderous task was still not finished, the shooting became even less organized and more hectic. The forest was so full of dead bodies that it was difficult to find places to make the Jews lie down. When darkness finally fell about 9 p.m., some 17 hours after Reserve Police Battalion 101 had first arrived on the outskirts of Josephau, and the last Jews had been killed, the men returned to the marketplace and prepared to depart for Bilgoraj. No plans had been made for the burial of the bodies, and the dead Jews were simply left lying in the woods. Neither clothing nor valuables had been officially collected, though at least some of the policemen had enriched themselves with watches, jewelry, and money taken from the victims. The pile of luggage the Jews had been forced to leave in the marketplace was simply burned. Before the policemen climbed into their trucks and left Josephau, a 10-year-old girl appeared bleeding from the head. She was brought to Trapp, who took her in his arms and said, "You shall remain alive." Starting Chapter 8. At Josephau, a mere dozen men out of nearly 500 had responded instinctively to Major Trapp's offer to step forward and excuse themselves from the impending mass murder. Why was the number of men who from the beginning declared themselves unwilling to shoot so small? In part it was a matter of the suddenness. There was no forewarning or time to think, as the men were totally surprised by the Josephau action. Unless they were able to react to Trapp's offer on the spur of the moment, this first opportunity was lost. As important as the lack of time for reflection was the pressure for conformity, the basic identification of men in uniform with their comrades, and the strong urge not to separate themselves from the group by stepping out. The battalion had only recently been brought up to full strength, and many of the men did not yet know each other well. The bonds of military comradeship were not yet fully developed. Nonetheless, the act of stepping out that morning in Josephau meant leaving one's comrades admitting that one was too weak or cowardly. Who would have dared, one policeman declared emphatically, to lose face before the assembled troops? "If the question is imposed to me why I shot with the others in the first place," said another, who subsequently asked to be excused from several rounds of killing, "I must answer that no one wants to be thought of a coward. It was one thing to refuse at the beginning," he added, "and quite another to try to shoot but not be able to continue." Another policeman, more aware of what truly required courage, said quite simply, "I was cowardly." Most of the interrogated policemen denied that they had any choice. Faced with the testimony of others, many did not contest that Trapp had made the offer, but claimed that they had not heard that part of the speech or could not remember it. A few policemen made the attempt to confront the question of choice, but failed to find the words. It was a different place and time, as if they had been on another political planet, and the political values and vocabulary of the 1960s were useless in explaining the situation in which they had found themselves in 1942. Quite atypical in describing his state of mind that morning of July 13th was a policeman who admitted to killing as many as 20 Jews before quitting. "I thought that I could master the situation, and that without me the Jews were not going to escape their fate anyway." Truthfully, I must say that at the time we didn't reflect about it at all. Only years later did any of us become truly conscious of what had happened then. Only later did it first occur to me that had not been right. In addition to the easy rationalization that not taking part in the shooting was not going to alter the fate of the Jews in any case, the policemen developed other justifications for their behavior. Perhaps the most astonishing rationalization of all was that of a 35-year-old metal worker from Bremerhaven. "I made the effort, and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mothers led the children by the hand. My neighbor then shot the mother, and I shot the child that belonged to her, because I reasoned with myself that after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to me, so to speak, soothing to my conscience to release children unable to live without their mothers." The full weight of this statement and the significance of the word choice of the former policeman cannot be fully appreciated unless one knows that the German word for release also means to redeem or save when used in a religious sense, that one who releases is the savior or redeemer. In terms of motivation and consciousness, the most glaring omission in the interrogations is any discussion of anti-Semitism. For the most part, the interrogators did not pursue this issue, nor were the men, for understandable reasons as potential defendants, eager to volunteer any illuminating comments. With few exceptions, the whole question of anti-Semitism is marked by silence. What is clear is that the men's concerns with their standing in the eyes of their comrades was not matched by any sense of human ties with their victims. The Jews stood outside their circle of human obligation and responsibility. Such a polarization between us and them, between one's comrades and the enemy, is of course standard in war. It would seem that even if the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 had not consciously adopted the anti-Semitic doctrines of the regime, they had at least accepted the assimilation of the Jews into the image of the enemy. Major Trapp appealed to this generalized notion of the Jews as part of the enemy in his early morning speech. The men should remember, when shooting Jewish women and children, that the enemy was killing German women and children by bombing Germany.